All right, progressive. The opening vignette is about Jane Addams, who set up Hull House. This was set up in the middle of a poor section of Chicago in an attempt to help the poor. All right. She believed that she could help the poor, even as another woman many years later was to try to do in India, Mother Teresa by name. But Mother Teresa found out that what she started out to do she couldn't do, that in order to help the poor you had to become rich. I mean, when they offered Mother Teresa phones, she said, oh no, my people don't have phones. But she eventually learned that she could help the poor better if she did have a phone. Then somebody offered her a truck one day. She said, the people that don't have trucks, but then she decided she could help the poor better if she did have a truck. So basically, to make a long story short, somebody offered her a nice house, which she took. Basically, she found out to help the poor, you have to become rich. Just pure and simple. So she wound up accepting all these gifts by people who wanted to help her cause. Well, Jane Addams learned that in order to get what she wanted done, she had to become involved in politics. And you can't become involved in politics without sometimes taking sides and without getting your hands dirty. So politics can be a very, very dirty business. All right. Churches aiding, but churches helped her out by spreading what was then called the social gospel, where the churches said that our main mission now is going to try to help the poor and emphasize less saving people's souls and emphasize more helping the poor get their food and clothing that they need. Again, each of you can decide for yourself what you think about this. In the meantime, a lot of Germans and Irish and Italians were coming into the country. This immigration thing is not new. They were disliked, and in large part they were disliked because of their excessive or seemingly excessive drinking at a time when Americans were trying to curb drinking. Again, folks, it wasn't just the churches, but factory owners wanted to have men and women come to their factories who were not under the influence. And people who operated railroad trains, they wanted to have engineers who were not under the influence either. So there was an attempt being made to curb drinking. And then in comes these foreigners' influx, and they drank, they might say drink like a fish. You know. A lot of women were working under very dangerous conditions that were very difficult to change. But in New York, at a clothing mill, and if any of you know anything about clothing mills, they're susceptible to fires. A big fire occurred. The women found out that the doors that they were supposed to get out of through were locked to keep them from getting out, one thing. Now today this practice is outlawed. I mean, if this school put a chain lock on one of these doors during this class session and the government found out about it, well, I mean, okay. Some elementary schools, to try to prevent hoodlums from coming in, will lock their doors with chain locks. And when the government finds out, they say, remove this, what if a fire breaks out? But anyway, in this case, the chain lock was to prevent the workers from leaving. A fire broke out, and a lot of these workers, female workers, had to jump from 10 floors, and none of them survived the jump. It was either that or get burned alive. And it was like, well, generations later, when the towers were caught on fire on September 11th, a lot of people jumped from 1,000 feet up. And again, what choice did they have? And none of them survived the jump as far as we know. But none of us know what we do under those conditions, folk. None of us. But anyway, the fire did a lot to convince people that women were working under unsafe conditions. There was a famous Supreme Court case, Mueller versus Oregon. Again, court cases are written in cursive. Mueller versus Oregon said that women could not be worked any more than 10 hours. Again, it was a law that favored women. It was, it was considered a time of victory for women. Later on, women were to say, oh no, law was sexist. And eventually it's not looked on as being such a victory today. But at the time it was considered a victory, where that the courts recognized that perhaps women should be treated with leniency. And eventually a bunch of laws were passed called manual labor laws that said that women were not to be subject to the same heavy lifting as men were. Today these laws are looked on by women as being, they were designed to protect women, they were looked on as being sexist or discriminatory. All right. President William McKinley was re-elected in the year 1900. He'd had a pretty good time of it as president so far, won the one war he engaged in, got the United States involved as a world power, and made himself popular by visiting the persons who were stricken by tornadoes, hurricanes, natural disasters. But in 1901, he was assassinated by an anarchist. The anarchist did not believe that there should be any government at all. An anarchist assassinated a French president, a Russian Tsar, Tsar Alexander III by name, and an American president, and it seemed like they assassinated someone else in Great Britain. But they went around killing other countries' leaders. A new device had been invented, though, just shortly before, the electric chair. And for many generations, the electric chair was to become the favorite means of execution in the United States. Today, it's largely passed out of existence, but it was the method of execution for many generations. But Shaw's laws, the man who shot William McKinley dead, was put on the electric chair. Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, he had made fame for himself by leading the Rough Riders, a group of people, and led them up to the charge up San Juan Hill. He took them to Cuba and helped take Cuba. Become famous for this. He was elected governor of New York. As governor of New York, he was looked on as being, they hated him. So he said, I know what we can do. We'll promote him. We'll get him to be elected to a federal office. So they had William McKinley put his name on the ticket. He became vice president. Thought, based by moving him upstairs, we're rid of him. However, an assassin's bullet changed everything. Mark Hanna, who had made William McKinley president, I'm not going to write his name down, but Hanna said, that cowboy is president. He was actually right. Roosevelt was the only president we had at that time who had actually been a cowboy. He'd owned a big ranch in the Dakotas. Roosevelt had health issues, so as a boy, he had asthma. And he should not have qualified for military service. But nevertheless, the Army did not have such restrictions. No, my brothers and sisters, after I left the home and came south, some of my brothers and sisters attended a funeral of an old, saintly, godly old man. And when they went there, there was a bunch of soldiers who appeared there with an American flag and all that. And went, well, what? When did he serve? Turned out he served in the Spanish-American War. And I said, he must have been awfully young. And my mother said, oh, he lied about his age. And I could picture this saintly, godly, old man as a kid lying about it, but he lied to get in. And again, the Army did not have means to check up on you. Now today, you try to join, they're going to look for your birth records and look for all this stuff, but that's today. But in those days, they didn't have that. But in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, he really was not qualified for military service either, but he got by, got in. But he had health issues, and he went out to the Dakotas and got him a ranch, and operated a ranch for a while, came back, and eventually became President of the United States. His administration is sometimes called the square deal. Oh yeah, you may hopefully know we had two presidents by the name of Roosevelt. They were fifth cousins. They were very distantly related. They were both descended from aristocracy. Anyway, Roosevelt, this one, Theodore Roosevelt, his administration was, he called it a square deal.
Yeah, FDR, you made the New
FDR called his the New Deal.
Yeah, we
And Truman the Fair Deal. But anyway, Square Deal. He said, my office is the bully pulpit. In other words, I don't just preach like an ordinary preacher, but I actually act. And I'm going to bring down the bad guys, the big businesses, the bad guys, and trim them down to size. He's also known as the trust buster. He prosecuted more than 40 trusts. The first trust he prosecuted was Northern Securities. Now, he used the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed a generation before his time, before he became president. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed but never carried out. I say never, hardly ever carried out. But Theodore Roosevelt actually began to carry it out. He used it. The Northern Securities was a very large railroad company that also dealt in finance. Well, when the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, the Supreme Court did a lot to undermine it. But then the Supreme Court, sensing the mood of the country, somewhat reversed itself. Anyway, Theodore Roosevelt prosecuted this trust, got it broken up into several smaller companies. And the Supreme Court, the Northern Securities people took their case to the courts, and the Supreme Court began to reverse itself, and they agreed with Roosevelt. So the breaking up of the Northern Securities Trust passed. Now, in addition, there was another group of people called the muckrakers. You may not have read it today. At least two of my daughters did. My son never did. There was a very, very popular book called Pilgrim's Progress that in those days everybody read. Pilgrim's Progress featured a man who was a muckraker. That is, he was always looking for filth. So he always had his head downward. And because he was finding so much filth to be cleaned up, the people in heaven wanted to reward him. But he could not raise his head long enough to receive the reward. He just kept on looking for filth. Well, these muckrakers were looking for corruption in government, corruption in politics, or corruption anywhere they could find it. And sometimes they got so busy looking for corruption that they could not appreciate some honors that were sometimes bestowed upon them. But anyway, Roosevelt sided with him. And one of the things he got passed was a Pure Food and Drug Act, which is still on the books.
So it was only looking for corruption in the government or just anywhere?
Corruption everywhere. Muckrakers, it wasn't just for corruption anywhere, including in your food and drugs. And he got, thanks to the efforts of the muckrakers, he got past Roosevelt the Pure Food and Drug Act, which said that food and drugs had to pass certain measures in order to be legally sold. Now, some years ago, there was a man who was peddling sea silver at $40 a bottle. And this sea silver supposedly had all the elements that your body needed, but not in a pill, but in a liquid form. And you drink this sea silver, it was supposedly going to make you thin because your body would no longer be demanding food and curb your appetite. But it had all the nutrients and all the chemicals, but he never got it approved. The government ordered him to stop selling and pay back the people whom it sold to. Again, because he had not gotten his product approved. Now, the Pure Food and Drug Act eventually came to require that you prove what you're saying. Now, again, Listerine used to advertise kills germs from millions on contact. The government never told them it didn't. The government said, it's up to you, you prove this. You've been advertising here, now prove it. And another thing about that's been done in the Pure Food and Drug Act, this took a long time. Cigarette smoke, tobacco. For many, many years, a lot of persons suspected it caused lung cancer. The tobacco companies fought it. Eventually, thanks to the statistics and computers, We are now convinced that cigarette smoke causes cancer in some people, but folk, you do have people who are chain smokers who live to be over 100. And this was the argument he used. And I talked to a friend of mine recently who said that his father lived to be 95 and he was a heavy smoker. Don't think I'm pushing for tobacco smoke, folk. Most people who do eventually get lung cancer and they live noticeably shorter lives than people who don't. This has now been proven by statistics with the help of computers. But the Pure Food and Drug Act eventually was used to require that all cigarette cartons contain a warning, big enough to be seen, not fine, but big enough that on one side of the package, cigarette smoke causes lung cancer, or cigarette smoke contains carbon monoxide. You've all seen the warning. Smoking during pregnancy creates a big risk of miscarriage. You've all seen the warnings, even those of you who don't smoke. Again, thanks to the Pure Food and Drug Act. All right. Roosevelt also set up national parks. He said he was going to preserve these pristine areas for future generations, and he was not going to, said in these parks hunting would not be allowed. You know, he was going to let wildlife be wild. Now, he's been criticized because a lot of people visit these parks, and you go to these parks, and of course, along the side of the road, you can't say it's natural. And snakes that try to cross the road are very, very often run over. This is known. But also, the wildlife just simply moves itself away from the roads and deeper in where that you and I never see it. But nevertheless, the idea was there. Now, I had a student do a paper on the national parks one time and point out how it did not really do what they claim, but nevertheless, it does keep a lot of people from moving in and preserve wildlife in places that the government wants it preserved. Now, he tried to keep Japan from becoming too strong in the Far East. Now, folks, you've got to keep this in mind. This is going to eventually lead to war with Japan. But Japan was becoming strong and threatening to take over a lot of the Far East. And eventually, for a short time, they did. And Japan fought a war with Russia. Roosevelt moved in to try to keep the Japanese, number one, happy, and number two, keep them at peace. He got together what's called the Great White Fleet and sent it around the world on a goodwill mission to display American might, among other things. Temporarily, Japan was placated. Now, we're going to have a lot more to say about the relations between the United States and Japan throughout much of the rest of the semester. He negotiated a dispute between France and Germany. France and Germany got into a dispute over Morocco, one of the colonies. Germany wanted territory in Africa, which it didn't have. Roosevelt persuaded Germany to back off. But eventually, though, this might have been a mistake because Germany was alienated from the United States, and of course, you all know this was to lead to not one, but two wars between the United States and Germany. Maybe, but again, nobody knows the future. All right. Okay, folk, getting carried away. Be back in about 10 minutes.